Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of JFD Podcast Record Club, where each week one of us recommends a new record to review, and then we all review it. And this week, we're going to be talking about Riley's recommended record. We're going to be talking about Colin Stetson's new History of Warfare Volume 3, To See More Light.
We've talked for a while about the fact that we try and keep the Record Club series as varied as possible, and yet I think we've only done two jazz albums, John Coltrane's Ascension and John Zorn's Spillane. I don't know if we've done another one since then. Both of those, incidentally, were really early on in the Record Club series. So for a while, I've wanted us to do another jazz record, but I've definitely wanted us to not do a classic jazz record. I've wanted us to do a modern jazz record, and there's actually quite a few from like the 90s onwards, like really sort of out there records that do interesting things with jazz templates or jazz instrumentation. But I kind of on a whim picked this one, and it's a curious pick even for me for a few reasons. One, it is the third album in a trilogy, and you don't need to have heard the other albums in the trilogy, but it's also like not even the most beloved or widely regarded album in that trilogy. That's definitely Volume 2, Judges, which is generally regarded as like one of the great modern sort of minimalist jazz one-man show records. But I've kind of always liked To See More Light, which is the kind of sequel to that, more. And I'll explain why, and I will, in the process of doing that, drop some really interesting information, I think, that contextualizes the experience of listening to this. So for anyone who doesn't know, Colin Stetson is a saxophonist, a composer. In recent years, I think he's become more known for his film compositional work. He's been a close collaborator with Ari Aster and has sort of bounced around the place, creating these very sorts of jazzy, eerie scores for films like Hereditary, Color Out of Space, various TV shows, some of which are more interesting and better than others. But the presence of Colin is always a signifier that you're going to get something original, something fresh, and some unusual textures and timbres from the woodwind instrumentation of the saxophone that you would not typically get. And the thing about Colin is that while I'm sure it's physically possible for other people who are as experienced as him and as frankly ripped as him, and with as much physical strength, and I don't just mean externally, I mean internally, as I'll get to in a second, I'm sure they could produce the sounds, some of the sounds maybe that Colin does in the way that he does them, but no one can compose and perform in exactly the way that Colin does for the extended periods that Colin does. And no one, I think, visualizes and understands and has the particular vision for his instrument in the same way that Colin does. And To See More Light, I think, is one of the best displays of that. The most interesting thing about this record from the off is that there are no overdubs on this album. Colin Stetson is the only musical performer on this whole record. There are guest vocals on a number of songs from Justin Vernon, aka Bon Iver. That's the only music you're hearing on this record that, or of any kind, that isn't recorded live in a single kind of thing. So Colin is not only playing his saxophone in the more or less conventional way, he's also using it to produce very unconventional sounds to kind of provide counterpoint to the kind of main aspects of his playing. He's using his body as percussion as well. Very creative uses of microphones and mixing from the electronic artist Ben Frost, as well as a close collaborator that enhances the sound of this record. And the reason that Colin is essentially able to produce multiple different types of sound at the same time is because he's mastered a technique known as circular breathing, which is an incredibly difficult skill that a lot of, I would say, higher level saxophonists try to master, where you can essentially produce sound at the same time as inhaling. So you can essentially inhale and exhale at the same time continuously and never have to stop playing your instrument to breathe. And Colin is able to take advantage of his ability to do that, to create some really unique eerie and bizarre compositions that frequently bridge the gap between sheer beauty, but a kind of like haunted and sort of contorted beauty, and kind of horrific shit as well, like pure heft. Like the thing I love about this record so much is that it is a great dynamic showcase for how tender of a performer Colin can be and how brutal of a performer Colin can be as well. And it's all wrapped up in this sort of broad conceptual bow of taking from a lot of sort of spiritual music and spiritual tradition, rediscovering, I think, the saxophone's power to evoke spiritual sounds or to channel something that we associate with a kind of spiritual timbre or tone that is accentuated by the choice of there's a spiritual cover on this. What are they doing in heaven today? There's general motifs and themes that I feel like are more ethereal even than what Colin typically does in tracks like the opener and In Truth. And in some of the more, and one of the great standouts of the record are Among the Ceph, which is this kind of haunting centerpiece track where he's doing these amazing melodic trills while simultaneously creating this sound with some other part of his voice box that sounds like a ghost is singing to you. The vocal timbres he's able to produce on this record are really startling, and also complemented by Justin Vernon, I would say as well, who you get doing his very much Bon Iver thing on a number of songs here. But then again, you get a song like one of the other big standouts here, Brutes, which is essentially kind of like a noise, power electronics, blackened death jazz song. Where essentially
blackened death jazz.
Well, I mean, you're going to look at me and tell me that I'm wrong? No,
Absolutely not.
But like, where Colin is essentially like, through whatever witchcraft he's able to summon from his gigantic lungs, playing the saxophone in a way that makes it sound like he's physically molding the hardened steel of its shell with his hands. Like, it sounds like he is crushing the instrument. And here's what Brute sounds like. Colin Stetson is blowing into his saxophone and playing it like an accordion at the same time. Somehow he's manipulating physics. You're listening to fucking Dwayne The Rock Johnson sit on a fucking piece of tin while a man blows into it. I have struggled to find ways to describe how this track in particular sounds. It is, and this is before you even get to the points in the second half of the track where Justin Vernon is doing some actually surprisingly impressive and successful death metal fucking shrieks and howls that are complementing this utter fucking violence that Colin is enacting to his instrument. It's out of this world. The record, I would say, it's fair to say, doesn't necessarily like hang together perfectly as this kind of holistic, consistent piece of work. And I'm sure that we can kind of talk about that a little bit. But that's not even really, I mean, that doesn't even really bother me all that much, because so consistently Colin is doing different, original, and really striking things with his instrument on almost a track by track basis. I don't think there's a single song here, except for maybe Among the Ceph and In Truth and stuff. There are moments where he will play his instrument in a way that approaches a conventional or familiar tone, but they're exceedingly rare. And even when they do happen, he is also, because of his circular breathing technique, doing some other weird shit with his voice just to kind of paper over it and make sure you don't ever for a single second think you're listening to a normal jazz album. It's a strange experience, and it is unwieldy and confrontational, and I find it extremely fascinating. And it's also a kind of a benchmark record for me in terms of getting into more alternative jazz, let's just say, because it came out in 2013 at the peak of a time when I was getting super into, exploring all the different genres of music, and I had familiarized myself with like the core, Miles Davis classics. I was listening to Kind of Blue and stuff, and then and then this came out, and it caught wind of it, and I was like, I didn't think this was jazz. I think when I encountered it, I just thought, okay, and maybe you could make the argument it isn't. I mean, what is jazz? Look, I don't know. I struggled to describe what Colin Stetson does, except to say that it's incredibly idiosyncratic and incredibly unique and kind of awe-inspiring. What do you guys think of Colin and his playing style and what he's doing on this record?
I hate to defer to rate your music so frequently just because it makes me seem like a fucking plebeian, but I read a comment of a review, or a review really, that perfectly described my reaction towards this, and it is as follows: Colin Stetson's Saxophone is America, and this is the Korean War of albums. And I feel like you might need to be a little bit brushed up on your history to fully understand what that actually means. But basically what all of Riley just explained, I knew about more or less maybe like half of that. And you don't need to be a kind of musical or jazz scholar to understand just how impressive Colin Stetson's playing is from like a raw musicianship standpoint. I feel like that's one of the most cursory, obviously impressive elements of the music at hand here. And that's cool. And the sort of trouble I have with To See More Light is that the sort of post-minimalism avant-gardeness, it's like it becomes so frustrating to actually attack this from a critical perspective when your perspective is like, boy, I wish these songs had more structure. Because like sometimes they cohere into these really impressively textural exercises of really definitive movements that do feel like, they are, minimal, they all are avant-garde, but it's the longer songs on here that I think, predictably kind of impress me more. The title track very specifically, and the closer, Part of Me Apart From You, are two moments where I think this album really coheres into its biggest strengths, and those two songs represent a pretty decent chunk of the album overall. It's just kind of a shame that a lot of the other songs on here, as soon as they form an interesting, coherent idea, they immediately end. Listening to Colin play his instrument is never not impressive. But if you've listened, for example, to the Hereditary soundtrack, you are undoubtedly familiar with the siren tone that he is able to evoke out of his saxophone. That is one of the most alien sounds in modern instrumental music. That like it's a perfect musical element for horror movie soundtracks, which is why I think he's in that field. But on here, boy, do they use that siren tone a whole lot on every song. And I kind of wish that there was a few other ideas on here. There's a lot of technical proficiency, but the actual like versatility of what's happening isn't really fully fleshed out for me. There is a lot of interesting stuff going on here. I'd say a solid third of this album is like, I see the vision with it. And it's like, it becomes this really, really fascinating exercise in this very specific corner of music that I completely get. There's another third of the album that's almost there, but is still interesting enough for me to parse through the fact that I'm not like actively seeing the matrix, as it were. And then there's the other third that I find just a bit patience trying. So it's a mixed bag, but it's a mixed bag that I can't fully like. This is something that I would steadfastly recommend everyone listen to, just on the off chance that I feel like this is also something that I can completely see like a bunch of people just being like 5 stars. This is an intergalactically insane musical experience that is wholly captivating from beginning to end. I am just sadly not one of those people.
I mean, like the simplest way to put it is if like, what if a saxophone sounded really fucked up? Just like beat, like somebody was beating on it with a lead pipe while this dude was playing it. I think there's a lot of value in that, and I think I would have a better time with this album if there was something it was attached to, in the sense of like, I enjoy the Hereditary score more than this because
Same.
is so tied in with that movie and what it adds to that movie. And I really don't find this album to be that different of an experience to that album, but it's also, this is the thing, and it's not something that's made to accompany something else.
I think it's very much fair to call this more of a collection of experimental ideas in different possibilities of what Colin can do with his saxophone than a traditionally structured album. And I think that's absolutely fair game for criticism. But now that we've kind of got that out of the way, some of the moments or just textures and timbres on this thing that are like, that take my breath away. I mean, I've already talked about Brute. How do you make it sound like the thing you're playing is turning into metal, like just melting in your hands? And Colin is really, really great at doing that. And again, putting it up against something like Among the Ceph, where essentially he's giving you these beautiful frills that I can see would probably be easier to appreciate if you had already been exposed to them for extended periods of time on the record. But in and of itself, gorgeous sounds and compositions, and that wailing vocal that he's able to do is so eerie and haunting and just recontextualizes the instrument so much. It sounds like when I listened to Among the Ceph this morning, I had the thought that it sounds like the saxophone is crying because Colin is being so mean to it.
Please stop.
Have mercy on me. And yeah, it's truly like, this is again me being kind of stupid and saying something kind of stupid, but it almost feels like when you listen to this record, especially because it's just Colin and the saxophone, minus Bon Iver occasionally just singing, but it's just Colin as the only musical performer on this thing. And so it really feels like, when you listen to any of his records, I suppose, but I feel it particularly here, you're like listening to like this, a man kind of tumbling with a beast, essentially. It is like man versus nature in a weird sense. It's like,
except the saxophone is man and Colin Stetson is nature.
It's like the musical equivalent of like The Revenant in some ways, where you're just like, you're immersed in this like brutal, chilling kind of like.
And Bon Iver is Ryuichi Sakamoto.
Yeah, I mean, credit to Bon Iver. He does, as I said before, he does like showcase a few different modes on this record. It's not just him always doing the thing that he does. You can't imitate him. He has that voice. And it's kind of funny when you put this record on, he's like the first thing you hear. It's kind of like, wait. What, am I listening to a Bon Iver album? But
yeah, it did. I did have that moment. I knew this was a Colin Stetson album, and that is the extent of what I knew. So sit down, and it sounds vaguely like a late era Bon Iver record for a minute or two there, and I'm like, did they fuck up the files on Apple Music?
Instead of the most kind of like anodyinely produced, boring electric plucked guitars, you get this fucking river of simmering evil underneath his voice. This that Colin
struggle
is producing
between a man and his instrument, and then occasionally you get and they're just like, and then Bon Iver's in the background just like,
doing a little bit of a kind of like a castrated Eddie Vedder at certain points. Is how I like to think of it.
Deary.
The experience of listening to this record, another of the reference points that I thought of when trying to figure out how to describe it, it's like that Simpsons bit where Homer is like, saxophone, saxophone, trying to like get on the level of his daughter and her love for this instrument, but just completely being unable to comprehend what it is.
Colin Stetson manages to be so good at playing the saxophone that sometimes it sounds like he can't play the saxophone.
Yes, exactly. And you see the vision in those moments. Now, I've purposefully kind of danced around the biggest and I think maybe inarguably most impressive aspect of this album, which is the 15-minute title track. And I'll be honest up front, I very rarely listen to this as an album. A lot of the time will just, to be very honest with you, 80% of the time I'm listening to anything on this album, it is just putting on this song, this 15-minute beast of a song.
Easily my favorite thing here. Easily.
And
I mean, it's a title track for a reason. It is the album.
Yeah. And I would like, and it's a testament to, I guess, the rest of the record that I enjoyed as much as I do, and the variation I think helps in my case. But if this were just this song and it were just an EP, I would give it, a perfect score probably. I legitimately like, I mean, I've heard this song so many times over like nearly 10 years since it's come out. And I think it is the moment where, a lot of those structural criticisms that Jake and Morgan have fairly leveled on the album kind of are melted away into a single track that kind of perfectly executes and showcases Colin's compositional skill. Because a lot of it is just textural stuff. Like Colin is exploring texture and sound, and there's not really a lot of composition that it's built into. Hunted, I think, is a good example of this. And the third track, which I can't remember the name of, both songs I love, and they have really fascinating and unique textures, especially that third track is super eerie and spine-chilling and often doesn't sound like you're hearing a saxophone. But they're satisfying and rewarding to the extent that you're interested and invested in those textural experiments. They're less so if you try and think of them as songs, I suppose, which maybe is part of the reason why he got Justin on here, to try and songify it up a bit more. But all of that fades away when you're listening to the title track, because this is a perfectly constructed piece of, like, this is the one-man show, this is the soliloquy, this is the monologue, this is the this is the Oscar reel, is just this song. I think if you only ever listen to one thing that Colin Stetson ever made, that for some reason was a situation, I would strongly recommend picking this. My God, is this amazing. It starts off super sparse with these just kind of singular sort of blasts that he's just kind of shooting through the saxophone. And then slowly it kind of picks up speed and he starts doing that kind of wobbly sort of continuous murmuring sound, and he starts manipulating the pitch of it. He starts manipulating the timbre, the intensity as well. It's just kind of walking you through all the different ways that these sounds can sound. And he's still doing it in a way where you feel like you're listening to a piece of music that is progressing, that is moving somewhere linear. And it builds up and builds up and builds up. And one of the things I love is this gets more pronounced as the song goes on, but you start to get a feel from it early on. You can hear Colin breathing as he's playing if you really pay attention. I mean, not even if you really pay attention, you can just hear it. You hear him inhaling at the same time as you're hearing sound come out. And, that's why I think it's so wild to think about this as a no overdubs single live performance record, because it doesn't make sense that you're hearing someone inhale and you're hearing all these sounds happen at the same time. But he also takes advantage of the fact that, we're recording this with probably like 12 microphones, right? He's got one right in the saxophone. He's got one on the fucking ceiling. He's got one on the floor so that he can stomp his boot to make the percussive sounds that are essentially happening in the second half of this song. He's got microphones up the wazoo, and credit to Ben Frost for like taking in an output of like a dozen microphones and making it sound like a single coherent thing, right?
I almost feel like we lose something in not seeing that. Like as a performance, it feels like this would be complete as an experience, and I could like fully appreciate and grasp it if I was looking at it happening. That would be cool as fuck.
Yeah, and I know that he did tour around this as well, and I would love for him to have an excuse to tour again. He hasn't put out a solo record in 5 years. I hope he puts out another one soon, because I've seen recordings of him perform live. In fact, I think there is footage of him playing this track live. It's not amazing footage, but it does exist, and it does give you a sense of it. And yeah, you're seeing all of these sounds be produced by this man who is essentially holding this woodwind instrument so tightly you feel like it might explode in his hands like glass, and at the same time violently attacking the floor below him. And what's really interesting about watching Colin perform is you can see the way he has to physically, maybe this is the wrong word, but he has to kind of physically hurt his body in order to make a lot of the sounds happen. You watch him play his saxophone, and you can see in the image behind me that it's a massive saxophone, and you watch him kind of hunch over and manipulate the shape of his body so that he can compress his lungs together, or he can kind of tighten, restrict his throat so that he's able to produce a very specific sound. You see him essentially, it looks like he's in agony when you watch him play. It looks like he is torturing himself. And
I mean, it can't feel good.
yeah, I mean, I would love to have a conversation with him about what the physical experience of playing is like. But anyway, as the song progresses,
Cronenberg Crimes of the Future shit just to play your saxophone.
As the song progresses, the tempo sort of builds. And I find as it goes on as well, you forget less and less that you are just listening to a one-man show, essentially. The presence of alternate musicians or of even like a conventional rhythm section isn't really missed, because Colin is giving you so much and he's really filling in those spaces. But there's a point in the second half of the song where it kind of changes tack completely. And Colin starts to do this thing with his microphone that I would describe as a woolly mammoth impression. Like you've been hearing this inhaling, right, in the first half of the song while he's playing. And in the second half of the song, suddenly he vibrates his vocal cords while he's inhaling. And suddenly he's using that inhalation to make a vocal line, this thing that he's doing. And it's kind of like you're listening and he's stomping on the ground, and it sounds like you're watching a fucking prehistoric woolly mammoth trample past you, essentially. It's like that scene in Jurassic Park where you see the fucking dinosaurs for the first time, except this time you're actually underneath the fucking foot of the Diplodocus or whatever, and you're just watching it fucking walk all over you. And then there's like what I can only describe as somehow the most terrifying moment on an album that also contains the song Brute, which is the moment where he first does that kind of scream into the saxophone where he's just blows really, really hard, and suddenly he's using that, he's trying to, he's just kind of like using the saxophone to like attack the ear, attack oxygen. It's nuts. It's crazy. And he keeps doing this and building it. It's this an intense, lumbering, metallic, heavy piece of music. And it builds and builds and builds. And I can only describe the last, say, 2 or 3 minutes of this song as utterly inhuman. Like, I don't know if I believe that this is, I don't know if I can believe that this is all happening live with one instrument.
Sure there's not an overdub here? Are you sure?
The part at the end, he's doing like, so he brings back all the different musical motifs that he's introduced throughout the song, essentially. And in the most cosmic display of big dick cuckery, just starts doing them all at once, suddenly, and just intertwining them and cutting them together and just making all of these sounds, and then doing the thing over top of it while he's doing it. And then he builds to this like final moment at the end of the song where he brings like the core sort of melodic part back in, and it's like, you fucking what am I hearing? And it just ends with this fucking shriek, and it's gone. And it's like the most 15 minutes of fucking having your mind eaten in front of you. It's the scene in Ridley Scott's Hannibal where, you know, Ray Liotta's brain is being eaten, except if that were like, you know, good. And
yeah, I was gonna say in a good movie.
Well, forget about how good or bad it is. It's like that experience is what this is like. It's like you're watching Colin Stetson stick a fork in your head, pull out a chunk of your brain matter and eat it in front of you. And I can only admire the man. All the structural qualms aside, and they definitely exist, and I don't deny them at all. There is just, the reason I come back to this record is that it is such a feat of human endurance, essentially. And what Colin does here, I would say, is more impressive on a technical and physical level than most things that you'll experience in music. I mean, this is not to denigrate the, you know, thousands of amazing musicians that we, you know, completely fillet on this show all the time, the thousands of amazing prog drummers and guitarists and all that sort of stuff that we love to talk about, how they push boundaries and do shit that sounds completely unreal. That's amazing. But what Colin does is somehow in a league of its own, all the same. When you hear, and you know, Neil Peart or whatever drumming, it sounds fucking phenomenal, but it's not that difficult to imagine it happening, because you know how, because
it like recognizably is drumming. Like you understand that it's drumming.
Whereas when you listen to Colin Stetson play his saxophone, I almost feel like if you don't know what you're listening to already, how the fuck would you? Like,
yeah, no, I completely agree.
It sounds like an alien transmission, but like it doesn't actually sound like the transmission itself. It sounds like the transmission flying in the atmosphere and hitting you in the head and cutting your fucking face in half. Words. This is what this man does to me. I mean, look at him. Look at
that massive behemoth.
You may not like this, but this is peak masculinity, and you'll never.
I mean, who wouldn't like that?
I can't explain this, but Colin Stetson projects like immense trans mask vibes with an instrument.
Yes. All right. Favorite tracks and ratings then for To See More Lights. Jake, why don't you go first?
My three favorite tracks gotta be To See More Light. That's the showstopper here. I really also do like Part of Me Apart From You, Closer, two best points on the album for me. And then I gotta say Brute, just for how purely assaultive it is. It's the album's most aggressive tendencies all piled into one track.
I've listened to Brute like at least 100 times probably, especially because it's so short, and it's still, when it gets to Bon Iver's death metal screams at the end, I still get startled at what
that's
I'm
the
hearing.
Homer Simpson scream moment. You're like, my least favorite is probably In Mirrors, just because it's so brief. It just doesn't really like, I just don't know why this is here. But I give the album a 6 out of 10.
Yes, I will say the title track in Brute, and I will also mention High Above a Gray Green Sea.
Yeah,
that was good too.
Good one. Good song.
Yeah, least favorites In Mirrors. And I will also give this a 6 out of 10.
Alrighty. My three favorite tracks are To See More Light, obviously, Brutes, obviously, and Among the Ceph, magnificent song. Least favorite is, I suppose, In Mirrors, yeah. And I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. I just have really, it's a really important record to me that was one of those eye-opening moments for me in terms of like what jazz can't and can be. And yeah, that's my thoughts, which means we get an average overall of 6.7 for Colin Stetson's To See More Light. Let us know at home what you think of this Colin Stetson record, of any Colin Stetson record. What do you think of Colin Stetson as a player, as a performer, as a hunk of man meat? Let us know in the comments below. We want to hear from you, and we want to continue the conversation with you. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, and of course subscribing if you have not already. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, you can head on over to the YouTube link in the description and hit us up via that method. If you want to go above and beyond and support us even more for just $1 a month, you can hit the join button and become a member of the Jams and Tea family. Support us directly. Get your name featured in the title crawl of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Yamaha, revs your heart.